Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Meeting Jesus in the Gospel of Mark as we're resuming our study now in 2022, and we're doing so in session 11, and we're only at Mark chapter 6, so I'm going to have to pick up the pace a little bit if we hope to finish up by the summertime. Isn't it nice to think of the summertime that will one day come? Tonight in Charlottetown, it is a balmy minus 18 at the moment, so wherever you are, if you're joining us from afar, hopefully it's a little bit warmer where you are and snug and cozy in your home. So, once again, the PDF for this session and all previous sessions are available online, as are all of the previous sessions in video format online as well. And you're welcome to tune into those and download those at any time. Are there any questions before we begin? Other than, where did I get this sweater? Well, let's get going then. So, Mark chapter 6, verses 30 is where we're starting. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. So no room to eat. Right off the bat, you know you're in the Gospel of Mark because there's Peter complaining once again that there wasn't even room to eat. If you remember where we were a month ago, the apostles have returned from their mission to the surrounding villages where Jesus had sent them. And they seem to have met with some success, so that once again the crowds are such that they can't even have a chance to sit down and eat in a quiet moment. And being good and observant Jews, you are required to be seated while you're eating. This is something that you can always tell a tourist in Jerusalem, because they'll grab a bite to eat and they'll eat as they walk along. But observant Jews will never stand or walk and eat at the same time. You show respect to the food by sitting to eat. So there's Peter complaining that they can't even sit down to have a bite to eat. And it sounds as though they've returned to Capernaum, which is Jesus' ministry base from the time when they were all sent away to the surrounding villages. Now, Jesus suggests that they find a quiet place outside of Capernaum city walls to get a break from the crowds. And they take a boat to get there in order, again, to get away from the crowds. Remember previously how Jesus had to preach from a boat because the crowds were pressing in on the shore. Well, now they all jump in a boat and sail away to get a break. So where are they going to go? Well, they take a boat to get there, so we know that they're going somewhere along the shore, but also to a part of the coastline that's not heavily populated, like Capernaum or Magdala. Now, we know Capernaum and Magdala to be large population centers with populations in the thousands. As they're doing work on Magdala, even these days, it's a big excavation site, an archaeological excavation in Magdala going on right now, and they keep expanding the estimate of how many people they were considering living in the village or the city at the time. At one time, I remember reading in a commentary that Magdala had maybe 300 people. Now they're guessing somewhere around 18,000. So this was a significant place, and Capernaum about 5,000 or so. But are you going to find a quiet place between them? Now, if you look at a map, here's the Sea of Galilee, our famous potato-shaped Sea of Galilee. And just about at the very top of the Sea of Galilee, you'll see Capernaum, and then Gennesaret, which is actually an area rather than a town. And then further down along the left-hand side, you'll see Magdala. So somewhere along there, they're going to be trying to find a quiet place where they're not in one of those city centers. Where can it be? Well, we know it's got to be reasonably close along the shoreline. It can't be that they went from Capernaum across the center of the Sea of Galilee all the way down at the bottom, because we read next Many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. So it can't be 30 miles. You know, people weren't marathon runners. It had to be reasonably close, but far enough away to get through. So what happens was the crowd's not fooled. They see Jesus and the guys get in the boat. They sail away, and everybody sort of says, "Oh, I think they might be going over here," and they run along the shoreline to keep up. The boat skirted the shore all the way there. Now, one of the places that is traditional, in fact, the traditional location for the landing spot is called Tabgha, and that's once known as the Heptabagon, and somehow Heptabagon became Tabgha over the centuries. And Heptabagon means 7 springs, and there are springs which feed the lake in this area. The springs are slightly warm. I've stood in one of the springs and collected some rocks and even found a very ancient arrowhead in one of those springs. And Tabgha is about a 45-minute brisk walk from Capernaum, and I've walked that many times, bringing groups along that shore of the Sea of Galilee. So Tabgha is further along. This is one of what they call a pilgrim map, which has the main sites. You'll see Capernaum near the top, and the arrow is pointing to Tabgha. And what is in Tabgha today? Well, the Benedictine monks have built a retreat center and a church called the Church of the Multiplication. And it's got a main church and then a hostel, a pilgrim hostel on the other side. And in the summer times, they run camps there for children, disadvantaged children as well. It's a very fine place, and it's the main part of the church is actually built as a replica of the church that would have been standing there in the 400s A.D. It's the same archaeological style and the same stonework and everything. So it's kind of like a time machine going back 1,600 years into when this church would have been new. And this church that you see here was built on the footprint of the original church that had been built there. There was a small church built there in the early 300s, which was visited by a lady named Egeria, who was a pilgrim visiting from Spain, going from area to area, and she describes worshiping in Tabgha and remembering the feeding of the 5,000 there. And that church was expanded in the 400s and in the early 500s to the thing that you see here. Now that church was ultimately destroyed both in an earthquake and in military events, but this is a reconstruction of what that would have looked like. This is the main courtyard of the church, and the reason that I took this picture is because you see not only the shape of the church, but near the bottom of this image, you'll see that's a pool of water there. There's actually a bunch of koi, some carp swimming around in it, and there are 7 spigots, and those spigots with water coming out represent those 7 hot springs that made this area quite famous. It was great for fishing. To this day, if you want to catch a bunch of fish in the Sea of Galilee, where those hot springs come out into the water, there's a lot of fish that gather there. When you go inside, you'll see a very austere church, much in that ancient architectural style. The floor is a very fancy mosaic floor from the 400s. Beautiful big iron chandelier in the middle. On the bottom left, you'll see the gray stones leading into that doorway, and that's part of the original wall from the 400s. The tesserae, the mosaic stone floors, are from that era as well. And kind of underneath that big round iron chandelier thing, you'll see what is a communion table. And the most famous part of this whole church is part of the original floor that was in that church 1,600 years ago, and that's a very famous mosaic of the 2 fish and the basket of loaves. And this is an image that you'll see in Christian iconography all over the Holy Land and elsewhere as well. And you'll see kind of that darkish area is the top of the rock, and that rock marks the spot, as it were, where tradition remembers the feeding of the 5,000 taking place from there. So pilgrims have been going to this place to remember that event for the better part of 1700 years. So that's what you see there now. But we read, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. Now, this event, and the way that Mark reports it, is rich with imagery from the Old Testament. And it's really fun and instructive to look at this event and to tie it together with all kinds of stuff that's happening in the Old Testament. For instance, just this line, when Mark says Jesus saw them and they were like sheep without a shepherd. And for people who are very conversant with the Old Testament, as Mark's audience would have been, that would immediately bring to mind a worry that was expressed by Moses when God told Moses that he would not be leading people into the promised land. If you remember the story from the Old Testament, Moses, after wandering with the nation for 40 years after their release from Egypt, made it right to the border of the promised land, and then God said, Moses, the people are going to cross, but not you. You're going to stay on this side. And Moses worries. He says, well, what's going to happen to them then? And this is Moses' complaint. Moses said, may the Lord, the God of the spirits of all mankind, appoint a man over this community to go out and come in before them, one who will lead them out and bring them in, so the Lord's people will not be like sheep without a shepherd. There's that phrase, sheep without a shepherd. And people would have remembered that from this very famous story of Moses. Anybody remember who Moses, or who God appointed as Moses' successor? Joshua. And Joshua is the way that we pronounce it. The name is actually Yeshua, or in Greek, Jesus. So we're being led into this whole story. When you link this passage together with this event, Mark is picturing Jesus as Moses' successor, the one that Moses said, come on, God, send somebody so the people are not like sheep without a shepherd. And Mark says, and that's Jesus. And rather than just bringing people into the promised land, Jesus is going to shepherd people into the promised kingdom. Any questions so far? That's a really neat link that you really got to know the Old Testament as those people did in order to pick up on that. And you wonder, well, how on earth could they remember all of that? Well, the other day I was reading a book, and one of the characters in the book said, I am not a crook. And instantly I thought of who? Richard Nixon, right? Now that was what, 1972? And just one line from Richard Nixon, I am not a crook. And now if anybody says, I am not a crook, especially if they say, I am not a crook, you think of Richard Nixon right off the bat. Because that is what our minds are filled with, filled with media and news events. Well, back then, no TVs, no media, no news events. People were bathed in these stories of the Old Testament. And a line like sheep without a shepherd, people instantly would think, Moses said that. Okay? By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. This is a remote place, they said. It's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. Now, one of the problems you have when you're traveling in Israel is that you want to go to a lot of different places, but some of the places you go to, there's nowhere to have lunch. Ironically, if you go to Tabcha today, there's a little snack bar where you can get an ice cream sandwich or something, or a glass of pomegranate juice, but you can't feed 30 people. In Tabcha, you have to then go to where the fish and bread restaurant is, and it takes a long time. Back then, not even a snack bar with Magnum ice cream. And so as a result, where are we going to get food for all these people? It's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside, say the disciples. Remember, the disciples just want to have some peace and quiet and something to eat. Right? You know what, Jesus? Send them away. So note the contrast between Jesus, who had compassion on the crowd, and the disciples who want to send the people away. Well, fair enough. The whole point of getting in the boat and getting away was to find a quiet place to rest and eat. Now they're in a mob scene again, 5,000 people. I can't blame the disciples for wanting a break. But Jesus answered, You give them something to eat. Imagine 5,000 people. You give them something to eat. They said to him, that would take more than a half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? So Jesus says, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. When they found out, they said 5 and 2 fish. That's not enough. Now remember, the disciples had just returned from traveling from village to village. Jesus told them, don't bring any money with you. Rely on the hospitality of where you go. Now Jesus turns the tables on them. People have come from all the surrounding villages, we were told, where the disciples had gone to spread the news. They relied on the hospitality of those villages. Now it's time to repay the villages for their hospitality. But that's not going to be easy because it's going to cost a half year's wages, 200 denarii. That would have been well beyond the means of the disciples. Now, a denarii, basically a day labor, you're digging a ditch, at the end of the day you get a denarii. That's your pay. That's the average rate of pay. And 200 denarii would have been well beyond the means of the disciples, not to mention the logistical difficulties of obtaining that much food. There's only so many Magnum bars that were available. But Jesus was never much troubled by logistical difficulties. Here's what a denarius is what you call 1 denarii. A denarius, denarii is the plural. And they generally have the emperor on one side and another symbol on the other side. That happens to be Julius Caesar. That was denarius from his day. And on the other side it says Pontifex Maximus. And that means he's the high priest. He was the head of the Roman religion as well. Remember the story when they're arguing about taxes and Jesus says, whose picture's on the coin? Caesar. Well, you better give it to him then. And so that's the kind of coin Jesus is talking about.
So I know this is a very simple question, and I probably know the answer, but every time when Jesus feeds the people, do they have to build a fire to cook the fish, or does Jesus just get them cooked?
Every time Jesus feeds the people, what?
Like, does he have to cook the fish?
Did they have to cook the fish? The fish are smoked or dried? Already. No. This is not freshly caught fish. This is fish that you'd already prepare, like kippers. Okay, you're cured or smoked or Okay, so they're not the fresh fish. It's not sushi. It's not sushi. There's some good sushi restaurants there, but not as good as here in Charlottetown. We have excellent sushi. So where are we going to get money to feed all these people? So the disciples, again, everybody's mind is now in the Old Testament, right? Because of that Moses line. And there's a common complaint in the Old Testament. You're faced with a big crowd. How are you going to feed them? Moses objected when God told him to feed the people, in this case, 600,000 soldiers for a month. And Moses says, well, would they have enough if flocks and herds were slaughtered for them? Would they have enough if all the fish in the sea were caught for them? Or another big story of a miraculous feeding, when Elisha asks his servant to feed the company of prophets, about 100 prophets who drop in for lunch. His servant says, how can I set just this one loaf of bread before 100 men? Would Jesus prove to be greater than Moses and Elijah? Or Elisha in this case. So you got the remote place, you got the crowd, you got the hunger, you got the miraculous provision of food, and all of that brings all kinds of images to mind, and 2 of the most famous being those from Numbers and 2 Kings. Now, in those stories, facing an impossibly large and hungry multitude, God says to Moses, is the Lord's arm too short? You will now see whether or not what I say will come true for you. And Elisha, speaking for God, says to his servant, the Lord says they will eat and have some left over. Remember that part. And also, Mark is also recalling and telling the story the way he is. His favorite messianic prophet, Isaiah, who Mark is talking about again and again, and Isaiah's vision of the heavenly banquet in Isaiah 55. Isaiah says, come all you who are thirsty, come to the waters. And here they are at the north shore of the Sea of Galilee in a place famous for the 7 springs, the Heptabagon. Isaiah continues, you who have no money, come buy and eat. Well, the disciples say, we don't have enough money. We don't have 200 denarii. And then Isaiah says, come buy wine and milk without money and without cost, or in this case, not bread and wine, but bread and fish. Now, there's another connecting sign. Of course, the feeding of the multitude also brings to mind the exodus of the Hebrews from Egypt and being miraculously fed in the desert, the remote place. And they were fed with manna. I think we mentioned it before. Does anybody remember what the word manna means? It means, what is it? What is it? People pick this stuff up. What is it? Taste it. Tastes like chicken. Now, like Moses, Jesus feeds the people with teaching and with miraculous food. But in Jesus' case, there are 12 baskets left over, sufficient for all the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, remember in the Elisha passage, it says, they will eat and have some left over. And here you go, 12 baskets left over. So Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. They sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and he broke the loaves. Just let me make the little point here. Some older translations will say he blessed and broke the loaves, giving you the idea that somehow he blessed the loaves. No, he gave thanks to God. He baruched, he blessed. And when you use that word, you're invoking the Hebrew prayer. Just like when we say he said grace, we don't believe he said grace. We believe that he said a prayer, right? If you say to somebody, can you please say grace? If it's your kid and they say grace, then you smack them, right? No, I told you to pray. In this case, he baruched, because the first word of the Hebrew prayer of blessing, of giving thanks to God for bread, is Baruch. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam hamatzi min harach. Blessed are you, Lord our God, who gives us the bread of this field. So Jesus looked up to heaven, gave thanks to God for the loaves and the fish, and then he broke the loaves, and he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of the men who had eaten was 5,000. This is the kind of it's like a flat bread. It's about 2 centimeters thick and round like a record album, for those of you old enough to remember what a record album is. And those cured or smoked fish. In this picture, the fish are kind of fresh looking, but they would have been the dried kipper-type fish. But I like this picture because of the shape of the bread, which is what the bread there looks like. So that's not a lot to feed 5,000 people. Obviously, there's a miracle going on in the distribution of this to 5,000 people. That's a lot of bread and fish. Any questions so far? Well, 4,000 people, but we're not there yet. That's another story. Yes, he did. No, this happens again in a different place with a different number of people and a different outcome. But interestingly, Jesus refers to both the feedings together.
So did that come from the little boy, or
Little boy's not mentioned in this one. Mark doesn't mention the little boy. It says, Jesus says, go see what you can find. And they come up with 5 loaves and 2 fish. But the little boy is not mentioned.
you have to wonder why those times when that happened, I mean, if that happened in Charlottetown, like, I can't imagine there would be a lot of people who wouldn't believe something special has happened here. We should listen.
Yeah, the question is people should listen to what Jesus is saying and doing, and they must respect him as the Messiah because of what happened here. And in fact, in some of the other gospel readings, we read that they wanted to make Jesus king as a result. Okay, Mark doesn't mention that in this story. This is a very short form of the story. Despite all that Old Testament imagery, Mark is more concerned with, in the way he's telling this story, with tying it together with the Old Testament events than he is with, where'd they get the fish, where'd they get the bread, and so on. And here's one that maybe you haven't thought of yet. By the way, I should, mention to the people online what on earth I'm wearing. I said that before Christmas, I was talking about John the Baptist being an important part of Christmas that we forget about, particularly an important part of Advent. And I put a picture of this beautiful sweater up, and I said, boy, If I had this sweater, if somebody were to give me this sweater for Christmas, I would wear it in the pulpit. Here it is. Somebody did. I'm wearing it in the pulpit. It's absolutely beautiful. Yes. Yes, question?
My 6-year-old is watching from home, and she said she loves it.
She loves it, absolutely. Yes, I heard there's comments already pouring in from around the world of people loving this. John, it says on the bottom, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And there's our man, John the Baptist. I wore this just for you. So something you might not have picked up, it suddenly occurred to me, I'm wearing this ridiculous sweater and didn't explain why. Something that maybe you didn't pick up, that Mark is tying this in with, and that's the famous Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. Again, parallels, the Lord is my, Jesus looks upon the people with the compassion of a shepherd. He brings them to green pastures, because the people are described as sitting on the green grass. He leads me beside the still waters. He brings them to this place with the 7 springs. He feeds them so that they shall not want. In his teaching, he restores their soul, and he guides them in the right path. In providing an echo of the heavenly banquet, he prepares a table before me. And then there's all these leftovers, just like in Psalm 23, my cup runneth over. Again and again, in the way that Mark frames this story, Psalm 23 is coming to mind. And so who is the shepherd? Jesus, the good shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd, the psalm that they knew as well as we know it, and it's pointing to Jesus over and over again. Now there's another passage, and you think, where have I heard this before? Because here, Mark writes in this story, looking up to heaven, Jesus gave thanks and broke the loaves, and he gave them to his disciples. Later at the Last Supper, in Mark chapter 14, Mark writes, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to the disciples. Exactly the same language, exactly the same words and terminology. When John tells the story in the Gospel of John in chapter 6, he links it together with the communion story with the Lord's Supper very, very closely. Mark does so with the language. And so the communion feast echoes this compassionate miracle of provision for all. You know, we seem to think sometimes that writers like Mark are just writing down an account of what happened. Okay, and then Jesus did this, then Jesus did that. But there's more thought being put into it than that. There's very direct links, hyperlinks we call them on the computer, between things that are happened in the past and things that would happen in the future. Final note, the number of men who'd eaten was 5,000. This and the instruction to seat the group in hundreds and fifties sounds very military. A centurion, for instance, a Roman centurion, the reason he's called a centurion is because he's in charge of a cent. He's in charge of 100, a unit of 100 soldiers. Here, hundreds and fifties. Now remember, in the story of the man who had the legion of demons, there was all kinds of references, the way that Mark tells the story, to the Roman legions as well, and the superiority of Jesus over Rome. Well, here, once again, rather than destroying Jesus, takes a Roman image of these 5,000 people seated in groups of 50s and 100s. That's an army encampment. Okay, that's an army number, a legion number, 5,000. Groups of 50s and 100s, that's an army, a military encampment. But this is a spiritual army. Jesus has spiritual legions of people that are being sent into the world and miraculously provided for. Boy, there's a lot going on in this story. That's easy to miss, but a great, great story. Now, there have been some commentators over the years who, for some reason, find it difficult to regard this story as miraculous, and instead say, well, really what's going on here is that Jesus, in providing this group of 5,000 people with the example that he was willing to share his own lunch, caused everybody else to share their lunch with everybody around them so everybody had plenty to eat. But the story is not talking about that at all. The story is saying this is very definitely a miracle where a small amount of food is being miraculously provided, as it was in the days of Moses, as it was in the days of Elisha, and then a foretaste as it will be in communion services throughout the world. Questions, points? Again, remember, if you're watching this on the web live, you can ask questions on the YouTube. Can we still do that, Melissa? Yes. And as a result, we can pass those on as well. Okay. So, intermission. And we have some singers and dancers who are going to come up and entertain us for a moment in the intermission. Ladies? No? Okay. Well, imagine my disappointment. You know, I wear the sweater. The least we could have. Next time I'll warn you. Okay, so we're going to transition from that story. But we're going to do so quickly because Mark begins by saying, immediately. That's one of Mark's favorite words, immediately. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. And after leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. Immediately. So, story's finished, 5,000, gather the bread, gather it all in baskets. Okay, fellas, hit the road, I'll take care of the people here. And they do. So, the disciples are sent to Bethsaida, which is about 8 kilometers east of where they are. The hour is late, the crowd is dismissed. Jesus says he needs time alone. It's been a really busy day. And so he went up a mountainside to pray and perhaps recharge if the miracle took considerable spiritual energy, as apparently these miracles would. Where did Jesus go? Well, we don't know, just up a mountainside. But basically, the Sea of Galilee, again, is in this bowl. And so anywhere you go, either than due east or due west, you're going up the side of some very steep hills. Maybe it's the Eremos cave up the side of the Mount of Beatitudes that we've talked about in previous sessions. I think I showed you a picture of Jacob and me in that cave. So where is he sending them? Well, the lower arrow, the big red arrow, is pointing to Tabgha, where our story has taken place thus far, most likely site, or the traditional site. And Jesus is sending them up to Bethsaida Julias. And you might notice that that's kind of a little bit inland. Bethsaida means the house of the fish, or the fishing village. What's it doing inland? Well, the topography has changed a little bit in the time since the story actually happened, with some very major earthquakes happening along the Jordan Rift and shifting the land as much as 100 meters away from one side to the other. And that there's towns that are being excavated in that area. They're not entirely, there's a big dispute right now going on just these days right now in archaeological circles as to exactly where Bethsaida was located, because there's 2 primary locations for it. Either way, it's either a little bit inland where we see now, which would not have been inland in Jesus' day, or it's right against, more or less against the shoreline. But it's still same general location, about 8 kilometers away. And as you can see, if you're going from Tabgha to Bethsaida, you wouldn't cross the middle of the lake. You'd go up along the shoreline, right? But is that what happens? No. Because we read this. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Okay. Shortly before dawn, he went out to them walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. So, what's going on? Well, we read that it's about what the Bible actually says. The language which the NIV has interpreted for you is on the 4th watch of the night, literally between 3 and 6 a.m. Okay? That's the 4th watch of the night. Again, military language. This is also interesting. 3 o'clock, when it's 3 o'clock, when the watch is changing between the 3rd watch, which is midnight to 3, and the 4th watch, which is 3 to 6, at that transition between 2:59 and 3 a.m., in the military encampment, a note would be sounded on a trumpet. Ba-ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba-ba. That's now the beginning of the next watch. And that note, that trumpet, is called the Gallicantu. The Gallicantu. The cock crow. The rooster crowing sound. And it goes 3 times. Da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da. So when Jesus says to Peter, when you hear the cock crow 3 times, the Gallicantu 3 times, by that time you will deny me. Okay. And so it's entirely possible that rather than an actual rooster, Jesus was talking about the Gallicantu trumpet sound, marking that transition between the 3rd and the 4th watch. Anyway, 4th watch of the night, Jesus goes out to them walking on the lake, not along the shore. Mark is quite distinct in saying he's walking on the lake. And the scene is intended once again, as we had that big storm at sea earlier in the Gospel of Mark, harken back to those Old Testament images of God as the one who tramples the waves, like we had in the stilling of the sea passage. Jesus is more than a successor to Moses who fills up bread baskets in the desert. Jesus is God himself walking on the water. Very curiously we read, he was about, or NIV says about, really the literal word is he wanted to pass by them. So there's the disciples straining away at the oars, wind whistling against them, and it says he wanted to pass by them. What's going on here? Why not rescue them from their peril? I remember once in a canoe, we were visiting friends at a cottage and they had a canoe. I was a little kid, I don't know what, I was 12 years old. And I said, can I go out in the canoe? Sure, kid, out you go. I didn't know a lot about canoeing, so I'm sitting in the canoe and I'm paddling away and I get out to the middle of the lake because the wind was behind me. And then I turned around to come back and the wind is against me, and the more I paddle, I'm paddling like this and going back further and further. And so my father and his friends spotted me struggling away, and they let me, stew in my own juices for about 2 hours, I think, as I was doing it. It seemed like that to me. So they get in the motorboat and they come out, and I was thinking, okay, great, I'm going to be rescued. And they just zoomed by, hey, and went by in the boat. They thought it was hilarious. Is that what's happening here? Why not rescue them from their peril? They're not in peril. What happens again and again, when we read this story, we start thinking about the disciples in the great storm at sea, thinking they were going to die. And they're terrified because they think they're going to drown. We read, they're terrified because they think they're going to drown. Here, they're not terrified they think they're going to drown. The wind is against them. They're not able to use the sail on the boat, and they're having to row, and the wind is pushing them the other way. They're not in peril. They're just not getting to where they want to go. And Jesus is going to pass by. There's no fear of drowning. They're straining at the oars, and they had been for some time. Now, there are 2 Old Testament passages which explain what's going on in Jesus wanting to pass by them. And one of the passages is from Exodus. And God is talking to Moses. And Moses says, if I could just see you, then I think everything would be okay. So the Lord says, in Exodus chapter 33, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. But, he said, you cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live. I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you. And exactly that same word is being used by Mark. It's not a common word. It's a trigger word to help us remember this. Or in 1 Kings, Elijah is hiding, and he doesn't know what's going to happen next. And the Lord tells Elijah to stand on the mountain, for the Lord is about to pass by. Again, a very rare word that's happening in this. So what's happening when Jesus wants to pass by his disciples while walking on the water? He wants to give them a vision of himself as the divine being, as the Lord who has the power over the elements themselves, and give them that reassurance. God cannot be fully seen. To look upon God is to like be an ant under the magnifying glass in the hot sun. But with Jesus, it's different. But Jesus is still demonstrating his divine self. One of the commentators put it like this: the one who comes to them on the sea is not simply a successor to Moses who fills baskets with bread in the desert. Only God can walk on the sea. And Jesus wants to give the disciples a vision of that. Remember, the transfiguration is still to happen. This is a foretaste of the disciples getting an idea of who Jesus is, because they still don't know. How do we know they still don't know? Because when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out, "Ah!" because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. They still didn't get it. They hadn't understood about the loaves. Otherwise, they wouldn't be amazed. They would expect Jesus to be able to do this. And then it says, their hearts were hardened. Yes?
This is not the second time. Have we already been in the boat where the storm was passing?
Yeah. We were already in the boat with the big storm earlier on in the Gospel of Mark. And Jesus calmed, end of chapter 4, and Jesus calmed the water. Remember, he was sleeping in the boat? Disciples woke him up. They're terrified. They think they're going to, don't you care if we drown? Jesus stands up, calms the water. They're not in that kind of peril. This is not a storm. This is the heavy wind.
But they were completely amazed again.
Completely amazed. They still don't get it. Their hearts, and this is why the line, their hearts were hardened. So Mark is giving an explanation here. So you got Jesus walking on the water. This is my favorite painting of Jesus walking on the water. And you know what's really hard to do? It's really hard to find a painting of Jesus walking on the water without reaching out to Peter. Right? But that's not happening here. Now, understandably, the disciples seeing someone walking on the water thought it was a ghost. They were terrified. Jesus calls out, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Now, again, we miss this in English. "It is I" can better be rendered, "I am." Don't take courage. I am. Now, the proper name for God revealed to Moses is I am. Cheni, or in Hebrew, Yahweh. Don't be afraid. Yahweh. God is with you. Even as you're straining at the oars, God is with you. This is what's called a theophany. That's your fancy word of the day. A vision of God. And the theophany is complete. Only God can walk on water. Only God refers to himself by that name. So, fed 5,000 people, walks on water. The disciples are going, "Who is this guy?" Jesus tells them, "Yahweh." And it says they still didn't understand. Their hearts were hardened. The divine nature of Jesus is further emphasized then by the sudden calm as he enters the boat. When he steps in the boat, water's calm, replaying the storm scene of chapter 4 in a single verse. But they still don't fully understand who Jesus is, despite the miraculous provision of food, despite the walking on water, despite, once again, the stilling of the waves and the stilling of the wind. What Mark says, well, their hearts were hard. Now, hardened hearts refers to disobedience, but it also refers to dullness. It also refers to obstinacy. So stubbornness, so disobedience, strict disobedience. Why doesn't that kid do what I tell him to do? Right? That's a hardness of heart. Dullness, is that kid so stupid? He keeps doing it. Obstinacy, why are you being so stubborn? Right? Those are three different states, all of which I was accused of as a child, quite rightly, by my parents, who today would say, how can you wear that sweater in public? Interestingly, Jesus uses those same words, the hardness of heart, about his opponents, as well as the disciples elsewhere. Like in Gospel of Mark in chapter 3, remember the guy with the withered hand in the synagogue? Jesus is going to heal the guy's hand, and everybody's just concerned that it's the Sabbath. And Jesus looks around at them, looks at his accusers in anger, and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. It says in the NIV, but this is actually the same word, at their hardened hearts. But he uses that same word for his disciples as well. For example, and this is many times for both, but in Mark 8, do you, the disciples, still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Because how else can you miss all this that's going on? And you say, oh, well, those disciples, my gosh, are they ever stupid? And their hearts are so, why can't they see? Why can't they understand? And we live the majority of our lives knowing who God is, knowing who Jesus is, and ignoring him altogether when we make our decisions. We have to be a little bit more compassionate, I think. See, for Mark, the gospel account, it's a gradual revelation of understanding for the disciples. And we, as the readers, are being brought along. You know, when Jesus is saying, what's the matter with you guys that you don't understand? That's for us. Because we don't understand. The difference between the opponents of Jesus and the disciples is that the opponents reject Jesus, but the disciples struggle on and they follow, it should say follow rather than flow, they follow in the midst of their lack of understanding and doubt, a lesson for all who were to follow. Yeah, we don't follow because we perfectly understand Jesus. We follow because of who Jesus is, even though there's things we don't understand. And this is an important line. If I were to say, here's the line of the study tonight would be, our failure to fully understand Jesus does not change who he is. The fact that the disciples didn't figure out who Jesus is, feeding the 5,000, stilling the storm, walking on the water, healing the sick, all the rest of it, their lack of understanding doesn't change who Jesus is. I remember very clearly, it was when I was doing stuff at Queen's University. So my first church, so back in 1988, a student came up and he said, I don't believe that Jesus is who Jesus says he is. And I said, okay, but you understand, right, that doesn't change who Jesus is. Your opinion and lack of understanding doesn't change who Jesus is. And that's what this lesson is telling us here as well. The fact that the disciples don't recognize Jesus as God doesn't mean that Jesus isn't God. Jesus is who Jesus is. It's our understanding that needs to grow. Now, where's Peter, though? You're still waiting for Peter to get out of the boat and walk on the water. But Mark doesn't include that in this story. Matthew does, Mark doesn't. You figure, if this is Peter's account, surely, like if the Gospel of Mark is Peter saying, okay, Mark, here's what happened, and tells us, surely Peter's going to include this. Why not? There's a couple of answers, completely contradictory, which spring to mind. These answers are my opinion. Okay. First of all, why isn't the story included? It makes Peter look too good as the only disciple to have such faith as to give it a try while the others stayed in the boat. The Gospel of Mark paints a picture of a Peter who's bold and brash, but also self-effacing. Even when he looks good, as in the confession at Caesarea Philippi, you're the Christ, he soon looks not so good. Get behind me, Satan. Peter is all too aware of his own failings, and he's too humble to make himself the star. He doesn't want to put himself above the other apostles, the other disciples. It's not about how great I am, Peter is saying. It's about how great Jesus is. Maybe that's one reason why. The other reason is the opposite. It makes Peter look bad in allowing circumstances to cause him to fail, starting to sink, even in a moment of triumph. Jesus accuses him of having little faith and of doubting. And perhaps this was too painful for Peter to recount. But the way, Joan likes that, but you know what? The reason I don't like this is because in the Matthew account, Peter walks on water, panics when he realizes, holy smokes, I'm walking on water, starts to sink. Jesus picks him up, and then Jesus says, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Who's he talking to? Is he talking to Peter, who had incredible faith to get out of the boat and believed that Jesus could help him walk on water? Or is Jesus addressing the 11 guys in the boat who are saying, "Oh, I don't believe I could, no, there's no way you're not going to catch me doing that. I don't believe that Jesus could help me do that." Who's Jesus talking to? I'm looking forward to that answer. I'm not going to find out till I'm dead. But it's something you look forward to. Anyway, it's not here. And you can take a position on either side. You can be as right as I am, because I don't know the answer. But our story continues. When they crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout that whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. I remember once being asked, how did they recognize him? I said, well, it looked like him. And they said, how do they know what Jesus looked like? I said, well, there's all kinds of paintings and everything. Of course, there wasn't. There wasn't. But the boat, the disciples, Jesus, I mean, he was getting well known at this time. And all you need is one guy to say, hey, that's Jesus, and everybody goes in. And so they ran through the whole region, carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. Now, notice when they crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. That's not where they were going. Does anybody remember that they were supposed to go to Bethsaida? Jesus said, okay, guys, get in the boat, go to Bethsaida, I'll meet you there. I even showed you a slide of the picture where Bethsaida was. I think I might have another one. Yeah, look at that. See, with Bethsaida at the top, and Capernaum is their kind of hometown, and further down that next dot is Tabgha, and they end up way in the Gennesaret Valley, on the complete opposite side. It looks as though, it's the opposite. So they land not at Bethsaida, but at Gennesaret, the opposite end of the north shore of the Sea of Galilee altogether. It's like somebody saying, all right, I'll see you in Stratford, and they end up in West Royalty. That's, if you're not from Charlottetown, we're very sorry. Or we'll see you in Cornwall, and they end up in Pownal. There, that'll help you if you're watching this from Calgary. It's the opposite end of the North Shore altogether. It also says in verse 47 that Jesus encountered them in the middle of the lake rather than close to shore. And remember, it would be a shoreline journey, not a middle of the lake journey to get to Bethsaida, where the natural route would take them. It looks as though the disciples had strained against the oars throughout the night to little good effect, probably 6 hours. Because the indications are that Jesus sent them away before it was dark, and then he comes to them at between 3 and 6 in the morning. It looks as though the disciples had strained against the oars throughout the night to little good effect. Is this a lesson that in the absence of Jesus, little can be done, no matter how much effort and strain that we're putting into it? But as soon as Jesus gets in the boat, the wind stops, and they come to a shoreline. The shoreline they come to is a completely different shoreline that they had intended to start out at. And they ended up at the Gennesaret Valley, probably between Capernaum and Magdala. There's a place there now called Gennesaret. You can see Gennesaret and Gennesaret. It comes from the same root word, and that's where they found the famous Jesus boat, the remnants of a boat from the days of Jesus, to give us an example of the kind of sailing craft that was there at the time. A very nice kibbutz there. And then we read, wherever he went, into villages, towns, or countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak. And all who touched it were healed. So this is the postscript to the story. Because you got Jesus landing. It says here, they ran through the whole region, carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. So automatically we know that Jesus is now traveling around. He's not just standing in Gennesaret. And wherever he went, villages, towns, or countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. So this is wrapping up the ministry of Jesus in Galilee. Mark is wrapping up this story at this part. We're going to go in chapter 7 into a different era of the ministry of Jesus. But the Galilee stories are coming to an end with this idea that Jesus is going from villages, towns, and countryside, and wherever he goes, the sick people are coming. So once again, Jesus is recognized, great commotion, people from throughout the region coming for healing. And it's a closure of that Sea of Galilee miracles with a synopsis of the healing ministry. And it says, even to touch his cloak was sufficient to provide healing. Remember the woman with the issue of blood? She touched his cloak, and she was, if I could just touch his cloak, and she does so. And Jesus says, wait a minute, I felt power go out from me when that happened. So that was enough. Now, I think we addressed it very briefly at that time, that it's small wonder that throughout the ages, religious relics, fragments of holy people or their clothing or places, were thought to have great spiritual value. That's not so much the case among Presbyterians today. We don't have a strong belief in relics as having some sort of inherent spiritual power. And there's quite a tradition from the founding of the Presbyterian Church at the time of Reformation about that. But, verses like this, if you even touch Jesus' cloak, you'll be healed. Or this even more disturbing verse from Acts chapter 19, where we read, God did extraordinary miracles through Paul, so that even handkerchiefs and aprons that had touched him were taken to the sick, and their illnesses were cured, and the evil spirits left them. Now, from verses and accounts like that, people said, well, there must be some inherent spiritual power, either in the saints, the parts of the saints themselves, or in even some of their clothing or their utensils, like a handkerchief, that would have some sort of inherent spiritual power. And they got this idea from verses like this. Okay? So I actually did a bit of a search on the Time magazine's top 10 holy relics. And they mentioned the Shroud of Turin, and this is the face that was painted on the Shroud of Turin. The blood of San Gennaro, which still remains liquid after a couple of thousand years. Pieces of Muhammad's beard, which I have visited at the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, big showcase, the Prophet's beard. Mary's holy belt, which I don't know anything about. John the Baptist's head. That's a great relic, John the Baptist's head. When Luther went to visit Rome in the 1500s, he became very skeptical about the relics that were there. Relics were a big deal in the 1500s. Until he once was invited to view a relic, the head of John the Baptist at the age of 10. And Luther thought, wait a minute. Buddha's tooth is another big one. The tunic of the Blessed Virgin, the grapevine cross, the footprint of the Prophet Muhammad, and I visited that at the top of the Mount of Olives. The chains of St. Peter. There's a church which houses the chains of St. Peter in Rome. What Luther wrote 500 years ago is, says, what lies there are about relics. One claims to have a feather from the wing of the angel Gabriel. The Bishop of Mainz has a flame from Moses' burning bush. How does it happen that 18 apostles are buried in Germany when Christ had only 12? Okay. And again, the famous story of the head of John the Baptist at the age of 10. John Calvin, the founder of the Presbyterian Church, actually wrote an entire treatise on relics in 1543. And I've got several pages of notes here, which I don't think I'll burden you with, but the introduction of it more or less sums it up. St. Augustinus complains in his work entitled The Labor of Monks, writes Calvin, that certain people were, even in his time, back to 400 AD, exercising a dishonest trade, hawking about relics of martyrs. And he adds the following significant words. Should they really be relics of martyrs, from which we may infer that even these abuses and deceits were practiced by making simple folks believe that bones picked up anywhere were bones of saints. So Calvin's big complaint is there's all these relics that people go and visit. They're probably not the actual relics anyway. And I think I mentioned, it was probably in a sermon around Christmas time about John the Baptist, that he's venerated by Muslims as well as being a forerunner of the prophet Jesus, as they call Jesus. And if you go to Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, you'll see the forearm of John the Baptist encased in gold as a very prominent relic. Well, Calvin says, well, you shouldn't put any confidence in any of these things because basically, look at all this stuff I have for you here. Calvin writes, in conclusion, it would be most important to abolish from amongst us Christians this pagan superstition of canonizing relics, either of Christ or of his saints, in order to make idols of them, for this is a defilement and an impurity which should never be suffered in the church. So Calvin says, regardless of this touching the robe of Jesus, regardless of the handkerchiefs of Paul, he says, we don't want to make idols of relics and canonizing things. So, you know, when the time comes that I shall shuffle off this mortal coil, I know that, you know, the instant desire of everyone here will be to venerate my John the Baptist sweater and to visit it and touch it and say, he once wore this glorious thing. Perhaps I shall have some of the power which came from... So Calvin says, don't bother. Don't bother. Maybe pieces of the beard, exactly right. We'll have some of that as well. Any questions as we wrap that up? Not about the sweater, but about the passage. Next week we have Mark chapter 7, the whole chapter. We're going to do an entire chapter, Mark chapter 7. Hopefully that'll work out. But let's close with a word of prayer. Dear God, we give you thanks. We give you thanks that so many people were fed on that day. We give you thanks that we have the opportunity to participate in the ongoing miracle of feeding the hungry by being generous in our response to the needs of the world. Help us to see you clearly, to see who you are as we encounter story after story of what the disciples took such a long time to realize, but is there for us to read and to see and to understand. And for this we thank you in Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen, and God bless you. Again, next week, Mark 7, the whole thing. Thank you for coming out, and thank you for watching and for the sweater. Yes? Now a question. Yes?
I forget where exactly in the Bible it says it, but it says somewhere that it's the shame of the man that have long hair.
Yeah, it's an Old Testament thing in the New Testament when the Apostle Paul is talking about the fashions in Corinth and that men were, there was a lot of cross-dressing going on in those days, and Paul was saying, you know, you should keep the roles pretty distinct. And he also says women should cover their hair, which is the practice even amongst observant Jews today. One of the reasons in Corinth that Paul talks about women covering their hair, wearing head coverings, is because it was a sign of class distinction. If you had a really fancy, elaborate wig hairstyle with pearls in it and so on, you were considered to be the upper class. And that was a sign of class. That was your most ostentatious thing. And also in Corinth, there was a guild, a very large guild of temple prostitution. And a lot of these temple prostitutes were being attracted to Christianity. And one of the signs of a temple prostitute is that they had a shaved head. And so if everybody had a scarf over their head, everybody was equal. In Corinth, that was a sign that you were a male prostitute, and so on. And Paul said, no. Well, in this they have John the Baptist because John the Baptist was considered to have taken a Nazirite vow, like Samson, so that his hair shouldn't be cut, his beard shouldn't be cut, he wouldn't drink alcohol, he wouldn't hang around with women. Not if you were to take a Nazirite vow. And there were certain religious ceremonies whereby you would cut your hair off, shave your head. We read about that in the book of Acts with the Apostle Paul. There's a time at which he shaves his head in order to participate in a particular temple ritual. Yeah, all the pictures are always with long hair. We don't know. Quite literally, we don't know. It wouldn't have been probably, waist length, effeminate type of hair. It wouldn't probably have been a Roman haircut because the Jews would have wanted to distinguish themselves from that. There are Old Testament rules about beards and hair and how you should wear those and what's legal and what's not. One thing we do know about Jesus is that he had a beard because it says that they pulled on his beard when he was being arrested and they tore his beard. And you have to have a reasonable amount of growth in order for somebody to get a hold of it. So we know that, but that's about all we know. So, but yeah, this is a classic. Many of the icons of John the Baptist from 1,000 years ago and more, this kind of scraggly look of a guy who, climbed out of a hole somewhere is your John the Baptist look. What's that? Yeah, out of his spider hole, yeah. I don't think Saddam looked quite like this. He looked still a little bit better fed. And he had a briefcase full of American money, too, which was ironic.